Goedenavond allemaal. Wat een genoegen om jullie hier vanavond eindelijk terug te zien. Hartelijk dank voor uw aanwezigheid op de eerste lezing van dit jaar. Ce 12 octobre marque en effet le coup d'envoi du cycle de conférences internationales d'architecture de cette année 2021 en présentiel. Quel plaisir de vous retrouver à cette occasion. Vanavond hebben Bozar A+ en het Design Museum Gent het genoegen het bureau Carmody Groarke te mogen verwelkomen. Het bureau werd in 2006 opgericht door Kevin Carmody en Andy Groarke in Londen. Ils nous expliqueront ce soir les motivations et ambitions qui sous-tendent leur production architecturale régulièrement saluée par la critique. Carmody Groarke heeft verschillende architectuurprijzen gewonnen, waaronder de Building Design Architect of the Year en enkele RIBA Awards. Ils ont aussi récemment été nommés pour le prix Mies van der Rohe 2022 avec le projet de la Hill House Box, dont l'image sur l'affiche de cette conférence a probablement attisé votre curiosité. Ik wil in het bijzonder ook de uitbreiding van het Design Museum in Ghent vermelden, een eerste project in België dat ze samen hebben ontworpen en zullen uitvoeren met Trans en Rest en in 2024 klaar zou moeten zijn. Avant de donner la parole aux architectes pour qu'ils nous en disent plus sur leur pratique, je tiens à remercier au nom d'A+ Architecture in Belgium, notre partenaire structurel Febelsem, notre sponsor structurel Assa Abloy, la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, de Vlaamse Overheid, het Brussels Stedelijk Gewest en de Stad Brussel voor de langdurige steun. Ten slotte bedank ik ook nog Bozar en het Design Museum Gent voor hun samenwerking in het kader van dit evenement. And now I give the floor to Kevin Carmody and I wish you all a good lecture.
Good evening, everyone. I was just trying to see out. It's lovely to see people again. Thank you all for making the effort to come to a lecture in real life. A few thanks to start with. Firstly, many thanks to the Bozar and A+ for the invitation to speak. It's a double privilege for us tonight to be here with you. Firstly, because this is the first lecture that we've given in person in 2 years, and we might be a bit rusty, so please bear with us. Secondly, because we're here to talk to you about our very first project in Belgium. The major part of the talk today will be about this project. A special thanks to our client, Design Museum Ghent and Gent, for allowing us to talk about the new project. We'd also like to thank the Bouwmeester and the government for the support, but also the funding for such an important project for the city. Lastly, to thank our collaborators on the project, Trans Architecture and Conservation Architects Rest, who have been a big part of the journey so far. First, an introduction to our Anglo-Australian practice. We're two people from very, very different backgrounds. One from the northwest of England, the other from the southeast of Australia. These images show the extremes of environmental challenges these places, and indeed the world, are now facing. Architecture has a big responsibility in confronting the climate crisis, in both construction and use. We show this image, or these images, I should say, not as an alibi for explaining what architecture should be, but to remind us that sustainability is now a responsibility for every building. The images on the screen are a visceral reminder that we cannot continue in the same path, and architecture needs to alter the way it thinks about using natural resources and building in the future. This is an image of our studio in London. I guess we started working together, Andy and I, as two voices from different places, reconciling differences and enjoying working together. We're often asked about the process of how we design. I think the best analogy is 2 coffees and 1 pen. And by that I mean, if you give 2 architects 2 pens, they draw 2 different things. But you give them 1 pen and it's a conversation, drawing over the top of each other's ideas and into each other's thoughts. And perhaps the coffee might turn into beer at some point. I think the reconciliation of ideas and values is very important in that conversation. So here we are from London, now working across the UK, Europe, and as far away as Australia. Those 2 voices are now more than 50 and represent 21 countries that bring different experiences and backgrounds to the conversation about what architecture should be. For this, we're very grateful. To set the scene of what we're going to talk about today, we thought it would be really helpful to focus on 3 projects. I will take you through the 7 July Memorial and the Windermere Jetty Museum, and Andy Groarke will then come to stage to talk about the Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House project. We're using these to perhaps as an introduction about how we're thinking as we're approaching the Design Museum Ghent, and hopefully will give some insight into both our process and where we are in the project. Over the past 2 years, we've been reflecting on what we do now as architects. I think everyone's been in that position. We've witnessed some generationally important global shifts, and they continue to affect our everyday lives. The tragedy on the left of the Grenfell Tower fire in London, in which 72 lives were lost. I guess it's a reminder that the building industry and architecture in the UK has been deregulated to a point where the market or economics is our primary control. The UK is still impacted by the political will of the 1980s. I'm sure some people here might remember that. Which created a lack of trust in professionals. It also led to a deregulation of architecture and the divergence away from a single professional responsibility in construction. And we see this as the outcome. Ultimately, this changes how the culture of how we build and what we build from, and indeed, whose risk it is to build. This has distanced architecture and architects, I should say, from the culture of how we make cities, and in fact, for whom. This is reflected in the lack of a city architect in the UK, no Baumeister. And the UK cities indeed further deregulation that planning and architecture may now suffer post-Brexit. On the other hand, the COVID pandemic has seen other challenges for cities. How we respond to the changing demands of where and what we need space for in the city. In the extreme of this, we see the image on the right. This is day 2 of 9 of what was a triage hospital built in Wuhan in only 9 days at the beginning of the pandemic. A building that was punctual as architecture can be, to care for people at an uncertain moment in the virus's trajectory. In a world that is increasingly remote, we're lucky today isn't, but isolated and doing things online, we feel that architecture's responsibility will increasingly be to connect and make physical the relationships between things and people, to bring people together as a kind of social necessity, connecting people to place and purpose, as well as each other. The image on the left is a touch point for our studio. We've written a number of pieces about it. It shows Sir Edwin Lutyens walking away from the cenotaph. It was the 19th of September 1919, and this was, in fact, meant to be the first peace memorial at the end of the war. What's interesting about this photograph to us is that, in fact, what we see here is a photograph of a temporary project. It was constructed in plywood and plaster and chicken wire in only 14 days from commissioning to opening. And we see the power of a temporary piece of architecture to garner the will of the people and the interest in such a way that this memorial, and you can see the wreath was actually a planted wreath and was formalized into stone, as we see on the right eventually. And now, a year later, I think in Remembrance Day 2019, this was built. And you can see that the memorial here has now garnered such support over the years that there are rituals around this cenotaph, this memorial each year. I guess we're showing this because our work as architects in our studio has varied greatly from the temporary to the permanent. The sole purpose of this memorial was to stop people forgetting for those who laid down their lives in conflict for the sake of others. I guess it's an architecture that allows people to come together for the mutual benefit and support of each other in order to make sense of a changed world. For us, this increasingly is the responsibility for architecture in our time. The challenge of doing the most with the least will remain for this generation, and rightly so. We see this as a changing territory of architecture, back to a more fundamental question about how we make things and how long each element should support each other to contain the purpose in its current forms. Our backgrounds and our times have influenced what is important to our work from the beginning, and more precisely from this time in the here and now. We want to talk to you about a number of projects which have influenced our thoughts on the Design Museum Ghent. This is a memorial, a starting point of a memorial, where we learnt about clients and who we work for as architects. Around 9 a.m. on the 7th of July 2005, 4 terrorist bombs at different locations around London were detonated, killing 4 terrorists and 52 innocent victims. It was the worst attack on civilian London in peacetime. Interestingly, the image is the first memorialization in culture. And this was the only image that was available. The other 3 bombs were in tube lines below ground. And somehow this image stays with us. An Act of Parliament was passed to make a physical memorial, a place where people from the 4 locations could come together individually and collectively to make sense of their times through the event. A competition was organised, and we applied. We were the only architects on the shortlist. The rest were artists. We won the competition by proposing an architectural process, a process of working with the clients. We described the clients as these people, but also future generations, because in our opinion, the responsibility of a memorial is to stop people forgetting. So in this sense, our client was very unusual. It wasn't a client who wanted to be a client. The bereaved family group had very, very different backgrounds, different contexts. It was a true cross-section of society. The critical identity of a project like this has to come from earlier research, and for us, this came from working with Anthony Gormley, the artist. Since the beginning, our studio has always been fortunate enough to collaborate with artists on projects like this. This is an architectural pavilion conceived of by Anthony Gormley. We're not suggesting it's our creative endeavor, but we worked very hard with him on the architecture, making the architecture disappear so his artistic idea was foregrounded. He wanted a concept where people walked into a cloud. Now, Anthony is very specific about that. It has a certain temperature, it has a certain density, it has a certain brightness, the air. And when you walk in there, it's an immersive experience, but it does to you some unusual things. First of all, your eyes are open and you cannot see. And so your brain tells your feet to stop and put your hands out. Now, Anthony is interested in the body in space. So your experience is suddenly a very immersive, singular experience, and people immediately were drawn to trying to find the perimeters of the world they were in with no Cartesian coordinates of sight. We also found that it brought people into close proximity with each other, which perhaps they wouldn't have done otherwise. The second experience was a collective or a social experience, as we talk about it. One where you stand back from this and you suddenly realize you're watching other people in an immersive experience, and you're watching that collectively and you're looking at each other. And so we took this kind of singular and collective experience away from this research as a kind of starting point of thinking about the idea. A memorial is a very specific and particular type of architecture. It's one that doesn't have any of the tenets of I guess, normal architecture, those of comfort or shelter. Its only purpose is to draw attentions to itself for the purpose of stopping forgetting, to resist amnesia, if you like. Very quickly, working with the families, we realized that they felt individually as though their stories were very different, yet they shared common ground. There was a collective need for a memorial, a response. And we began drawing with them the idea that one thing might represent one life, but many things could represent something much, much bigger. So the identity of the piece of architecture was one standing stone, representing a single life, and 4 locations somehow demarcated in that grouping, and somehow the event itself being more important to only these 52 family members, but wider London. The identity of this particular memorial is particularly complex. It's not like a war memorial, which can have figurative representation, and its responsibility was far greater. The 52 stelae were arranged in an interlocking pattern of 4 clusters representing the 4 bombing locations. Each stela, a standing stone, carried the name, date, and time, and the location of each death, but not the name. This was not a gravestone. We proposed a very unusual material for the memorial. It was a cast stainless steel. In order to melt stainless steel, it needs to be raised to a temperature of about 1600 degrees. We cast it in a sand casting, which was a fairly primitive way of making the stelae. So it took all of the imperfections of the casting process, and to put that into context, it was solid within 6 seconds. The casting process, in literally that time, took its shape and form. The timber former, one representation, was pushed into the sand 52 times, and we repeated that process of casting. So the casting fuses the letters into the form as well as the turbulence, the archaic artisanal process. So these became almost like standing stones. Some surfaces where the air, the open edge, is almost volcanic. Others on the bottom edge where you can see the recording of each of the times, date, and locations of those lives lost. So the memorial has 2 experiences. One, an individual experience where you're immersive, you move through and you try to understand the meaning of these lives lost and come to terms with those. Somehow the living walking among the representation of the dead, if you will. But it also has a deeper meaning where you get to the end and you're able to see the plaque of the names, recategorized, not in 4 locations, but in alphabetical order, bringing them all together in a way that suddenly this was one event for London, one important memorial for everyone to come to. I think the memorial has become a kind of nexus of formal commemoration for many, and interestingly, how it takes on rituals each year in ways you didn't expect. I guess for us, zooming back now, what we learnt about clients was that with a project with a design life of 250 years, the process of working with those clients, you realize our clients weren't in the room. Our clients are future generations and a responsibility to a wider city about what this could mean. And if it continues to mean something, it continues to be relevant. And if we can resist amnesia, stop people forgetting, then it's done its job. The second project we take you through, I'd like to talk about how buildings need to have a relative foreground and background. It's something we talk about in the studio a lot. This project focuses on the challenge of conserving an internationally important collection of boats. I guess, and the culture of being around water. The image is taken in the 1970s, and we particularly like it because it has two boats at two very different speeds that are in the collection. This is our site. We're in the northwest of England, those who haven't been there, the Lake District. Windermere, the lake is about 10 miles in length, and we're about halfway up it. This is Bowness, which is a fairly touristic town just outside of our site, which is highlighted there. What's really interesting about this particular site is this is the largest stretch of publicly accessible virgin shoreline on the east side of the lake. The rest is privately owned, and you can't get to it. So it's a really important public space. This project was won through an international competition run by the RIBA. The brief was to replace an existing museum built in 1977. This is a photograph we took the day we went for the site visits prior to the competition. And what we can see here is that the weather in this place is that extreme, that this building has been, and indeed the collection, has been slowly reclaimed by the weather back into the lake. The centerpiece of the historic museum was a wet dock, which was unsafe to visit when we first went there. And it had literally fallen into the lake, and you can see piers that are no longer on bases, and indeed the funnel of this steamboat taken off, because when the water level rises, it would actually hit the trusses. So we have this wonderful collection in storage, and we have these falling down structures. We began the project looking at two paintings in the collection, and we think these are really important to how we describe this project. The paintings are 18th century paintings painted by Lothberg, who's a contemporary of J.M.W. Turner, who I'm sure you know. De Lothberg depicts Belle Isle. Belle Isle is an island in Windermere. It's a particularly special island. It has a number of structures on there. But what's interesting about the paintings to us is that the first painting on the left, In the Calm, depicts Windermere as a picturesque setting. That's what it's famous for. A landscape gentle, soft, and beautiful. The second depicts Windermere as a landscape which is sublime, volatile, dangerous, with man at the mercy of elements. We're interested in this tension that this place holds between, I guess, the picturesque and the sublime. We're also interested in the fact that although Windermere is known as a picturesque destination in England, it's also indeed an industrial heritage. And this photograph is of our site that we found. And it shows a gravel extraction plant which was dredging gravels from the bottom of the fluvial lake to extract those to make roads and earlier the railways, which actually connected Windermere to the industrial cities of the north. Interestingly, the extraction of gravels made the deep water trench, which was actually formalized into the wet dock. The area was colonized in the 19th century as a playground for the wealthy industrialists who were connected by those new railways from the northern powerhouse cities of Manchester and Liverpool. Grand houses were built in the area in a similarly picturesque tradition. And this is a wonderful example of one. This is Broadley's Avoisey house, which is a mile from our site up the hill. I think it's important when we look at vernacular architecture like this to start to talk about what we're seeing. And we often have discussions in our teaching and in the studio about talking about things. So we see a retaining wall, a kind of raised plinth made out of kind of the rock and slate of the site, bringing the house up, which is stopping the house falling down the hill. Secondly, we see a house with a series of pronounced overhangs and a pronounced roof form indeed, portraying to the weather. This is the wettest place in England. And indeed, at the other end of the house, we have, and here you see an undercarving of the house where a kind of interstitial space is formed by carving the overall form of the house. It's not an overhang of the roof. In fact, it's a space for sitting outside and admiring the landscape, somewhere between inside and outside. This is the first sketch we did for the competition. And it's interesting that the ideas for our project as built are still retained very firmly in this sketch. Firstly, we're proposing a building that's built around a wet dock in the middle. It's a granular cluster of buildings. It's not one building, it's lots of buildings. The last thing that's probably quite important to this site is that you approach this site from all sides. You can arrive by water and by land from all sides. So the building is a solitaire, if you will. It doesn't have a front and a back. In fact, it's all front. We raise these granular forms up on a plinth, rather like the Voisey house, to bring it out of the water, out of the floodplain of the lake. Of course, the wet dock stays in the water. And indeed, certain buildings have a responsibility to be closer to water than others. And we see the primary responsibility of the cluster of buildings is connecting a visitor to boats and boats to water. Indeed, that's the purpose of the site. And we look to those vernacular ideas of carving spaces that make sense in this environment, to how we make spaces that are outside but under the cover of that roof, a cantilever roof form carved to make a space where you can be out there all weather and experience the landscape as much as the buildings. If you will, we began at this point to conceive of the museum as a coats-on experience. You could be inside or outside at many points. The formal idea of the project begins with one of those basic forms, square form in plan, and thinks about it as a tripartite relationship. On the left, we see an overhang allowing a person to be outside, connecting a view through a central nave, if you will, and then a support space that allows that project, that main space to perform its function, where all of the support functions can be moved to one side. Primarily, this project has to be about moving boats. We've learnt a lot about boats in working on this museum, but an important takeaway from this lecture might be that moving boats on water is very, very different to moving them on land. Some of these boats weigh 40 ton. And so we needed to think about how we move boats, how we can move boats around the site, what big boats could come out but need to be slipped back in the water on the slipway, how a conservation workshop needs to be closer to the water to allow boats to be tested and then brought out, and tested and brought out. And indeed, how the wet dock should be arranged with boats. Generally, boats point to land when they're in the water, and to water when they're on land. We see the central naves of each of those cluster of forms pointing to water, connecting each of those central spaces. Oh gosh, pardon me. Go back one. The conservation workshop, the main gallery, the wet dock, the education space, and the cafe, all polarizing views towards water. So here we see the main gallery space, and we see an incredible array of different types of craft over time that have been used on Windermere. The centerpiece, one of the most special steamboats used on the lake, which is held in a dry dock in the center. And here at the end, we see de Lotheberg's two paintings, one either side of the window. The calm, the picturesque, and the sublime, dangerous weather. And this window looks straight out to see the live weather report and towards Belle Isle. Each of these structures is very particular to how it's used. We have a wet dock built in simple timber, which creates an environment suitable, designed around the boats and how they're used, the light, the air, the atmosphere. We have a conservation workshop made in a much more robust timber for fixing, for tying, for lifting, and for working with these enormous boats. Indeed, the humidity even needs to be at the right level for them to reinsert some of these pieces that they're repairing on the boat. So we work with the environment to allow that to happen. This is a model that we produced about halfway through the design process, and I guess it shows us that at a certain point the projects have fused a material idea with a formal idea. We took the idea of making copper buildings, copper-clad roof and facades that tie the buildings in a material way together. These buildings nestle around that wet dock in the middle. We chose this material, and this is a view from the entrance, where we can see not only the framed views through to landscape, but that carved form that announces an entrance. But we also see the patination after a year, where the leeward and the windward face of this material marks the building in different ways, where the weather predominating from the lake changes the oxidization of this material, and we get a differentiating recording of time over the use and misuse of this building. We have very particular relationships between these overhangs. They allow a number of different uses, but they also allow and lead people through to the landscape. So there's defined routes that are understood through the forms of the buildings. And indeed, as I pointed out, there isn't a back to this building. We look at it from water on a number of sides, and this is from the boat pond, which is on the other side of the beck, looking back towards the entrance and the education space. And indeed, these overhangs are also for the conservation of boats, and we see here a reclaimed boat taken from the lake, the bottom of the lake, and which is slowly drying out over years. And indeed, not only the seasons, but the time of day records itself through these. We're delighted to see that the building is continually adapting. It's a framework for future use. During COVID times, plays were put on in the forecourt or the boatyard. Here we see the slipway and some of those boats in conservation processes, and we have a play occurring. And as we zoom back, we understand that the building is altogether a relative background to the landscape. And here we see in the distance Belle Isle that is framed through that main gallery window, and the building sitting within that rather sublime landscape that we see, and really hopefully nestling into what we think is a pretty special place to build a building. I'm going to hand over, if it's okay, to Andy Groarke to talk about the next project. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for inviting us here to speak today. Sorry about the proliferation of disaster images. I promise you it's not all going to be doom and gloom. We go quickly to Glasgow and then quickly to Ghent. The next project is about us being custodians for the care of culture. In the previous instance, it was about the care of a collection of boats. In this instance, it's about care of custodians of architectural culture itself. We're in the context of the second devastating fire at Glasgow School of Art, which all but has ruined the Charles Rennie Mackintosh's masterpiece. We've been fortunate enough to be working on one of his other masterpieces, in this case his residential masterpiece. It's suffering an entirely different fate, not dried out, burnt to a crisp, but soaking wet. It's 115 years old, but it's the owner of the building has come to a kind of real crisis point, a dilemma at this point in the building's history, as it's so chronically rain-soaked that it probably, until our project, would have only survived another 2 more serious winters. The reason for that is its location, partially. We're on the west coast of Scotland. You can see the sort of inner Isles here. We're 30 kilometres northwest of Glasgow. We're in a town called Helensburgh. The town of Helensburgh itself could be the subject of an altogether separate lecture. I don't want to do that this evening. Suffice to say that Helensburgh is on a kind of gridiron, rather like Glasgow. Begins in the Clyde down here and ends at the top of the hill where the building by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, 1902, was built. We're stood at the top of the hill. We're stood outside the gates of the hill house. We're looking down the We're looking down the gridiron through suburbia to the town, to the Clyde, and to the industrial heartland of the Clyde beyond. We're seeing Charles Rennie Mackintosh's vision in all its majesty here, in all of its modernist perfection. This is 2 weeks before the house actually closed, and it's belying a really kind of chronic construction fault, which has caused the decay. The rather severe exterior is belying very, very rich interiors, and interiors that were completely radical at the turn of the century, that were planned in the completely bespoke to the client requirements, the publisher Walter Blackie. We have kind of dark, broody spaces for Mr. Blackie and kind of light, bright spaces for Mrs. Blackie. This is one of her entertaining rooms. It looks more or less okay until you look a bit more carefully. And the house is really falling apart at this stage. To the point where when we first got involved, there were buckets under the construction. I want to rewind to the construction fault, really, which is both the genesis of the architectural genius of this project, but also the failure. Mackintosh kind of built these very imaginative forms which fused baronial Scottish architecture with influences from Japan and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and then built the sort of formwork in sandstone and brick rubble. That was then buttered all over with a concrete render from Southern Europe. Should have used a lime render, which was the vernacular thing to use. So the material was kind of poorly chosen, but it's sort of the image of the building at the time. What's happened is the cement render, concrete render that he chose is cracking. It's cracking, water gets in, freeze thaw, more water gets in, water doesn't get out, and it's a 115-year-old sandstone sponge soaking wet. The client ran a competition to sheathe the house in a scaffold and have a visitor pavilion whilst the conservation work to repair the house was going on. We completely disagreed with the premise of this idea. We've done scaffolding projects before. We've learnt a lot from building quickly and provisionally, and we really enjoy the immediacy of engaging with temporary projects and quick construction. But the reality of a scaffolding project is more like this. This is the photograph I took 2 weeks after the devastating fire. You can just about see, although you probably can't, the School of Art here, and about 10 meters of scaffolding, buttressing it. So we can't get close to the building anymore. We can't see the building anymore. Our proposal was quite radical. We make a very delicate enclosure, and rather than the pavilion on the lawn and the people on the lawn not seeing the house for, 15, 20 years, we put everything in the mixture. We put the visitor facilities and the people in the construction enclosure. We make a field hospital. The house is the patient, and this is the attendant form that goes over the top and stops the clock, halts the decay, and buys time for all of the academics to debate exactly what to do next. And there's lots and lots of different opinions about that. We make a metal roof. The roof keeps the rain out. We put the metal roof on a steel frame. The steel frame has dual or triple purpose. And then we create the visitor experience around the house. There have been plenty of examples through architectural history of where this has been undertaken before. This is Mies van der Rohe's Krefeld Villa. It needs no introduction. This is House Roeker & Co.'s 1971 environmental enclosure of that. What's so interesting to us about this project is by starving the house as a kind of subject of architecture of all of its context of light and view and surroundings, the architecture remains as a sort of artifact or a model, which is very, very curious. We also are interested in this idea that Cedric Price had of kind of, in the Fun Palace project, of these kind of venal, kind of structural, arterial routes through the building, this idea that the infrastructure and the movement of people through the building is as important as the subject of the structure itself. And so the subject of how people engage with this conservation project is central to the philosophy of this project. The building sort of is incidental to that central idea. We have three things. We have the house, we have the protective enclosure, and we have the visitor experience. And we have this very, very ethereal, lightweight, diaphanous architecture in counterpoint to the massive, heavy architecture of Macintosh behind. The two are in counterpoint. They're not the new architecture isn't trying to behave like the existing architecture. That very important membrane, we looked long and hard for very special materials that could create a very particular environment. We got this man and others from Stuttgart to weave 43 million links of stainless steel to make a veil, the biggest piece of stainless steel ever used in an exterior architecture project, to create a drying room. What's interesting about this enclosure, it's unusual. We would never have used this material before we had engaged with this project, but it was dead right for this project. What it does is it does three or four things. It creates a security enclosure around the construction, the conservation. It allows wind to whistle through, but rain not to get through. And it creates a sort of unique identity for the intervention, where you see the house and the house sees you. So that this kind of membrane comes in and out of focus as a piece of architecture. Its corollary, its counterpart, its consequence is the fact that the Macintosh interiors remain kind of daylit without having to draw down the light fast blinds that we used before the box was installed. The idea is to bring people into correspondence with this conservation project. That's really important so that people can be, visitors can be part of the debate about how we conserve this piece of architecture long term. They begin on a promenade at ground floor and they meander up. They meander up on these walkways. Up, 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 seeing the membrane on one side and the house on the other side. Another nice consequence of this kind of innovative use of this non-constructional material is we can create this drying room enclosure where rain can't hit the house, but wind can whistle through and dry it out, but bees can get through. Because of that, we can keep the tree that was planted in the early 20th century, one of the first pieces of landscape by Margaret MacDonald that was instituted at the house. And the visitors can get up close and personal with the construction and the defect and ponder the meaning of whether we should, or what we should do to repair the house. And all the while creating a belvedere to look out to the Scottish Isles of Arran, to link this kind of place and purpose and fuse this visitor experience with the house and the idea of the house at the top of the hill as this belvedere. We're really kind of accentuating that. And the figural qualities of the architecture, because of the choices of the materials we've made, are in kind of subtle correspondence with one another. The house is clearly visible as an architectural figure. This is clearly in the service of this. And I mean, one of the interesting dilemmas that the client has got now, the custodians of this piece of architecture, is since we've finished this project, there have been 4 times as many visitors to Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House than were when before the box was around. So not only have they got the double dilemma of what to do next, reconciling the differences of opinions of whether we should replicate the same construction defect for the sake of authenticity, but they've got the double dilemma of whether or when to take this away. As a temporary project, it was never conceived of that, but buildings have unusual, unexpected paths and lifespans. That's the subject of a book that we have just published. I believe it's in the bookshop, if you're interested. Shameless promotion there. And you know, one of the things that we're trying to draw through these projects that we're showing you this evening is, and we could have talked about different projects, but the idea of making, designing, research, and reflection on these projects all go hand in hand. It's pretty clear that the similarities on this project in Hamburg that we made has obvious influences by the research of Windermere and of the Hill House, of this idea that the temporary, unusual, rather unconventional projects on the margins of conventional architecture help us to imagine possibilities for more conventional typologies. This is a competition we won in Hamburg, where there's the ghost of a 1960s office block in here that we propose to retain rather than knock down, making a skeletal form that allowed us to build and retain this existing building whilst giving the new identity to the building and a permanent environmental repurposing of this project. This idea that we can find merit in built fabric is one of the one of the things I think architects are wrestling with, the idea that you shouldn't necessarily begin with the idea of the default of demolition, but we rather begin with this idea of kind of build on build and grafting and making sense of old forms in this artist studio where, the materials are kind of slightly less precious than in a commercial office building, but the ethos is exactly the same on that translation of scales. Taking care of culture, this is a new building that we're building for the British Library. We're custodians of about 6 million books in this new building. The British Library need to complete this by 2026 to care for the expanding collection. It's about as big as a football pitch on plan and 10 stories high. But the important thing about this project is that more and more the identities of these projects, and particularly this project, has been transfigured because of its environmental duties to the care of the collection. So this is going to be one of the most airtight environmental chambers and environmental buildings in yet to be built for an archive in the world. And yet, it would be such a shame if there wasn't a visitor experience of this. So we're taking visitors right into the belly of the beast and letting them look at 250 kilometers of fully automated National Library retrieval. Taking care of collections, we've done about 50 exhibitions internationally, worldwide. And sometimes the architectural project is a sort of vivid foreground, and sometimes it remains as a sort of more subtle background. But we're conscious that also our duties to collect, taking care of things are not just to collections or exhibits. This hospitality project only lasted for 3 years, but played a pivotal role in a regeneration project in King's Cross. We have learnt so much anthropologically in these short-lived projects about taking care of people. This brings us to Ghent. In 2018, we were invited by Trans and Rest, our local partners in Ghent, to submit for a competition. This is one of our competition images that sort of responded to one of the components of the brief to try and make a third space for the Design Museum in Ghent. In 2019, we were delighted to be selected as winners of the competition, and we're taking that forward, and we're at a really exciting point in time where we're about to begin building this project. This is a short story about where we've got to in this project, and in order to do so, we have had to be as outsiders to this situation, sort of detectives in the context and those issues of place and purpose of collection and local culture. First of all, where we are. We're in Ghent. We're in the historic centre of Ghent. This is the River Lee. This is the fortifications of the Gravenstein. This is St. Bavo Cathedral. And here's our site, a rather kind of odd cluster of buildings. This is Drabstraat, as it's known, and this is forgive me, Jan Bedelstraat. This view zooms in a little bit closer, and what intrigues us about this photograph is we can see not only the kind of aerial of the site at close quarters, we can see the Gravenstein, we can see the river, we can see this kind of confluence of streets. We can see the architectural morphology in a context that's perhaps very, very different to the projects that we've just shown you. It's cheek by jowl of house plots, row houses, but not row houses with a grand plan. Row houses that are built, and then another house is built next to it with a different party wall, a different roof form. So we have this very eclectic architecture. Just to orientate us on some of the buildings I'll be talking about. This is Hotel de Koning. This is a courtyard in the middle of this 18th century mansion. And this is an extension in 1992. And here's a merchant house called Huisleiten. This is the back wall to the courtyard. And this is a very unusual form of urban sculpture. I'll talk about that in a minute, but you'll recognize it as a toilet roll. Here we are in a plan. We have Hotel de Koning. We have the extension of Hotel de Koning around this glorious courtyard. And we have Huisleiten. And here's the toilet roll. We're just outside the Hotel de Koning. What really appeals to us about this entrance and this historic facade is actually these windows. You know, you can walk up to these windows and really have an immediate connection with an exhibition, with parts of the collection. It's really charming. And then we've got this really wonderful coach house entrance in the center. On the other direction of approach, on Drabstraat, we have Huisleiten with its sort of incomplete party wall. A house used to probably be built about there next to it. What I want to draw your attention to is this hoarding here which the museum use as a promotion of projects. It's a project space in its own right. Which sort of faces the incomplete courtyard, the toilet roll. I'll talk about the toilet roll in a bit. But it really is a showcase, and not more than an advertisement. It's a project space for the museum. So it faces the oncoming approach to the visitors. And so it has a very, very important significance, this gable, as it faces the approach. We're stood in that glorious courtyard, and it's really a sort of dissection of sorts of the various ages of repair and disrepair of the museum, and it makes a clear case for doing something about this rear facade. This is Hotel de Koning in its kind of refurbished glory. Here is 1992 wing, behind which is a totally new building. And here is a linkage, which is only 3 meters wide on plan, and behind that is the gap plot with the toilet roll on. A little speculation about why the museum is in Ghent, why the collection is so rich and glorious, and why the collection began here. This is a sort of map from the Middle Ages when Ghent was a prosperous, wealthy, productive city based on the trade and manufacture of cloth. It went into decline, and then it went into growth again in the Industrial Revolution. And during that time in the 19th century, a series of collectors of decorative arts and design formed a society and started to occupy, by gift of the city in 1922, the Hotel de Koning. And there was a very, very direct symbiosis between how the collection was generated and observed and how the rooms were used. So the architectural space and the collection had a sort of symbiotic relationship. That changed over the 20th century. And in the 1970s, there was a sort of sea change in the way that collections were generated, much more outward-looking than had been previously looking to local Belgian culture. It was much more outward-looking. It was also a time where the director, Lieven Danens, was also supporting architecture and design culture within the whole region and the city of Ghent, and supported architecture foundations like SAM with Marc Dubois and Christian Kiekens and others that generated a whole architectural generation and culture in the city. They also supported, which is fascinating, this chambre d'amis, which was a project in 1986 which sort of evangelized art projects within the built environment. This is one such interior project. One of the only remaining physical legacy of that is on the Hoosleiten facade, and this is a sort of sorry, forgive me, postmodern sort of intervention by Charles van der Hoeven, right next to the coach house doors of Hoosleiten. So the collection was expanding to Belgian, internationally important Belgian designers, Peter de Bruyne, but also to international designers, international design movements by Sotsas and Memphis and so on and so forth. And also promoting very, very important local Belgian designers that were getting international fame, Martin van Severen. So the bigger collection required a bigger building. So this was a tipping point in the history of this museum. You'll recognize this kind of view from the very first photograph. So we have the Hotel de Koning, we have the, Hoosleiten, and we have a wing called 1992 wing. And Willy Verstraeten's, the architect, Willy Verstraeten's master plan was to connect the buildings through a courtyard, but glaze over that courtyard. Underneath that, there was a proposal for a 600-seat lecture theatre in the ground, which also had kind of glazing on top, kind of curious design solution. A fully glazed building where the gap plot is at the moment, with what I believe to be a sort of director's office on the top. But times have moved on, and you know, we've reviewed what that design achieved and what that design didn't achieve, and we now sort of are picking apart the 1992 wing, which was built in a very, very heavy concrete construction, which is great because we can adapt it with relative impunity, with relative ease. But what we need to do is really evaluate ideas that were brought forward in 1992 about sort of museology, exhibition design, taking care of collections, taking care of people. In some of the interventions, just behind this facade that we've shown you, is a big void. The big void does a number of problematic things, in our opinion. It creates one fire compartment of basement, ground, first and second floors. So it exposes the collection to risk. It also doesn't give an equal experience for able and disabled people to the collection. And it causes some challenges to have exhibitions on one floor and exhibitions on another floor that maybe don't have compatible needs. So, and also we looked at some of the proposals about a south-facing glazed facade to make an infill, with the idea of kind of pulling light in and attracting activity to the building, but we really kind of can't agree with the environmental premise of using glass in this way at this point in time. The toilet roll was a sort of ironic installation as a sort of expectant need for a building to eventually take place on this gap plot. And you know, in the meanwhile, it contains the visitor facilities, literally the WCs, but it will be removed to make way for a new project. The project has many, many, many responsibilities. Care of the collection and care for the guests, the visitors, are two of the main concerns. We now have a collection of 22,000 objects, mainly stored off-site. It would be lovely to think that we could bring a lot more of the collection into close proximity with the visitors on-site. Indeed, one of the latest exhibitions that's just opened last week a 10-year retrospective of Müller van Severen, counterpoints historic elements of the collection with the very best contemporary designers in Belgium. And this sort of image sort of typifies one of those ambitions to celebrate Belgian design at the highest level, but also to tell stories about the collection. Here is our site. The site really has to do a number of jobs, but really its main job is to make an already interesting collection of buildings where you can have a diversity of design experiences just work better. So this building does a lot of the heavy lifting on behalf of other parts of the museum. And it needs to contain all of those ambitious activities that really broadcast and connect people to design collections. In his citation of the exhibition that we've just opened at the Design Museum, Peter de Jonck has a lovely headline to introduce the exhibition. He says it's a project of necessity and ambition, and I couldn't agree more with that. We really want to bring people into the museum at large, but have an immediate connection to design culture as soon as you get through the front door, such that really we see the whole museum as one complex of many rooms that can be explored, and that we can have an experience of design culture from the very first step. And that's sort of a reaction against this propensity, this trend to create vast foyers that place distance between people and exhibits, which we think is problematic and is so much less enjoyable than that look through the window on Jan Bredelstraat into Hotel de Koning. The brief was a very kind of large building. This was the competition brief. This is a slice from Drabstraat to Courtyard. It encouraged us to build high, 5 stories, very tall in the city. It encouraged us to build low, 2 basements. What we eventually came up with is a building that kind of squashed the program and made a lateral push into other parts of the program. We have this phrase, finding marginal gains in little bits of the rest of the museum to add up, to make this to be as an efficient as building as possible. We've eventually decided that we don't build down beyond the river level for collection management spaces, and we don't build as high urbanistically. But we create this house of many rooms. We've shown lots of entrances on this diagram. We've shown all of the rooms with equivalents. We've shown 2 routes into the courtyard as an orientation space. We see our role partially in our kind of rather broad architectural team as facilitators for lots of things for the museum to be able to do in the future, for future generations to come. So we're making our role in the project make the rest of the museum work better. And to create new rooms and existing rooms with much better relationships to the city and to the courtyard garden and to collections themselves. This phrase, marginal gains, this is one example of just adding up the little changes by taking out the column structures here and the staircases and the voids here. This, by the way, this is the movable floor, which has very seldom been used and is sort of begs a kind of revision or a relook at. We are aware of the problems of both circulation and visitor management, but also the risk to the collection long term if we don't do something that kind of partitions those floors, creates 50% more floor area for permanent collections, more collections on site, and temporary exhibitions, so we can run bigger blockbuster shows. This is an image of the ground floor. You'll remember the void was here. We fill the void in. We have a direct relationship to the courtyard. You can walk up to the window. The columns have gone. You can do a broader exhibition. This is first floor, permanent collection. Again, more opportunities with fewer obstacles, physical and non-physical. Top floor, once again, we get to these rather beautiful kind of decorative windows, and this barrel vault, 1992. We're not being pejorative about the ideas of big galleries and getting light, pulling light down into the galleries, but we need to be mindful, we need to be responsible about how we make those. And we've always thought of our job as really, to an extent, caretakers of the collection and caretakers of these buildings, such that, you know, the building, when it's in full swing, we can have this blockbuster show that links, you know, all the ages of the building. We can install a show through the front facade, through various different entrances, and keep other parts of the building open, or even lift collections to levels 1, 2 above ground through the front facade itself. So this becomes a sort of merchant's kind of depot as a facade idea. And then we get this kind of grand kind of salon front to back that links Drabstraat to garden. Once again, the ground floor is equally as important in that connectivity. But the ground floor as a public room gives over to the top floor as a public room, this city room, this loft, which becomes a sort of belvedere for looking at city landmarks, because we're just ever so slightly above the rooftops here. And that the relationship that the building has with the city is quite straightforward. You'll remember the billboard on Hoosleighton. Well, that has a similar relationship with a window which broadcasts the activity of the city room. And in fact, rooms kind of face in all different directions, and the rooms become transfigured into the forms of the building. So we're oscillating, we're going back and forth between city form and room form. Here, in fact, is our reconsideration of the billboard that face the visitors coming from the direction of the cathedral. This is, as we see it, a new project space, this facade. And yet certain views to the building have a rather more ambient, rather more contextual response to this idea of a row house next to another row house and another row house. And they all take their different identities, but they all somehow work in sort of formal correspondence. This sketch kind of keeps reminding us of our environmental responsibilities and how big we make a window and how we take care of the collection inside, how we don't overheat the building, how we don't spend too much energy in use, and how we make that part of the architectural identity, which in turn becomes one of these sort of pieces of architecture that announce it in foreshortening. And then the activity of the building on ground floor. The idea of transfiguration really works around these kind of two courtyards. There was a party for the opening show of Moulin van Severen on Friday night, and this is an amazing amenity to welcome people, to host people, and really get people kind of meandering through vernissages of new exhibitions. And we see the building, the roof terrace, as a sort of extension of that possibility of socializing these historic buildings. And then the second courtyard is it's a bonus, really. It's the gap between 1992, Hoosleighton, and the new building form, and it becomes another project space for the museum, a design project space, a place to foreground new young Belgian designers, either in horticulture or furniture or what have you. And then the ground floor also gives this possibility of opening up views to Hooslayton, these cross views, these new views to circulation, these front to back views in the courtyard, and a totally new circulation strategy guided by kind of windows and views and daylight and fresh air. In the basement, we have a totally new collections management center where collections can be brought in a number of ways. Under the main stack of 1992 new galleries, we have visitor facilities, proper fit-for-purpose visitor facilities for lots more audiences. The first floor, we have a lecture theatre. We have some very, very practical circulation. This is a big art elevator that allows us to get objects all the way up to the top floor, but host big lectures on the first floor. 150 people. This is a very large-scale model that's in the exhibition that we're developing the character of those, the scale and the character of those rooms with the client. Second floor, an education program space. Third floor, a purpose-built gallery, purpose-made gallery space with an events terrace overlooking the courtyard, where large objects can be brought up in that big art elevator, but you can get a sense of the circulation. The idea of seeing people moving through the building is also important, and also the connectivity back to the city. And the top floor is the city room, the city loft, which gets a bit more expressive in its form as it gestures, it tips towards these larger windows. This is the project space I was talking about earlier. And then lastly, we've been debating long and hard with our architectural partners in Belgium and our clients in Ghent about how city urban form turns into spatial form, but also into material form. We are very humbled by this very, very rich architectural culture in Belgium, and we really admire these architects that are building in materials that have such a strong, substantial presence. But we really must kind of question how we build and what we build. After all, this is a design museum that whose partial duty is to signal how design can meet the challenges of the modern world going forward, and how we build with materials that can engage visitors in those questions, in those kind of cultural, philosophical questions about the built environment and design challenges of the modern world. Our instinct is to build in brick, and yet brick is a carbon-intensive material. It fits well with the place, but it costs lots of energy. So we have a dilemma. Catherine Laporte, the director of the museum, has a vision which we wholeheartedly endorse of fusing as many young Belgian designers' work into the framework of this architecture as we possibly can do. So we're engaging in all of those material discussions, questions at this very moment about how our building is really a kind of backdrop of sorts to foreground these young, talented Belgian designers. We're trying to make this building without an ounce of concrete, a gram of concrete, I should say, above ground floor. We're proposing that this is an entirely engineered timber superstructure, which gives a very particular character for this museum. And also now we're getting into the issues of what we do when we're taking parts of the building away, including the toilet roll, but where we're carefully dismantling old brick walls, what do we do with them? Well, we think that we should see that as raw material and perhaps reconstitute some of those found materials into new elements in the architecture of the building. And to think of a strategy of circularity of using waste materials to make building elements that conspire to make the overall architectural urban form. We see them as indivisible concepts, the material and the form. We are beneficiaries of a really generous research grant from the government to look into this kind of circular material strategy, and in particular to look at making a very, very low carbon brick. Bricks are normally baked in furnaces to harden with clay. And we're looking at an alternative strategy for a brick. This is sort of some of the recent results here on the right-hand side, but the origins of that is a circular use of waste. What do I mean by that? Well, we're looking at concrete rubble, we're looking at porcelain, we're looking at glass to make a really interesting recipe for the substantial part of the material. And then we're binding it with a sustainably sourced lime. What that does, and we believe that this is a fairly unique thing at the moment, innovating with various partners in the UK and in Europe, to try and make this low carbon brick from lime. And we are trying to make that at scale at the moment, and we've got some really very, very promising results. Here are the bricks going into the brick press and industrializing the process. And we're bringing all of those materials within an 8-kilometer radius of the Design Museum in Ghent. I think that's not just an imperative to work in this way. I think it's a really incredible story, narrative for the Design Museum to tell about valuing materials in also many ways. These are some of the latest examples in the exhibition in Ghent. We're getting some really, really fantastic results. And you know, it's almost like we're sort of making a sort of handmade limestone that pay reference somehow contextually to some of these kind of soft chalk limestone landmarks of the rest of the city. And this is my final slide, where we're going one stage further. Sorry, I have one more slide. Going one stage further by actually using the brick itself as part of an exhibition initiative to imprint names into the bricks, so that people, rather like in the Hill House, can be involved in the sort of conversation about conservation and culture. But in this instance, visitors to the museum, to this exhibition that we have just opened last week at the Design Museum on the story that I've just told, can actually hopefully participate in experimenting, making some of these bricks themselves, so they can be part of making the story of this building. Thank you very much.